You're finished here, Elena. Nobody wants a woman who can't even keep her own family together running anything, let alone advising my company." The words hung in the rain-soaked air outside a train station cafe, sharp enough to cut glass. Richard Colton stood with his umbrella tilted just enough to keep the drizzle off his $3,000 coat, sneering down at the woman he assumed he'd just destroyed. Elena Marsh said nothing. She simply looked at her watch. 3 days later, in a private boardroom 40 floors above the city, Richard Colton would sit across from a lawyer, a set of documents, and a name on a letterhead that would make his coffee cup shake in his hand. But that moment was still coming. For now, all anyone saw was a quiet woman in a worn gray coat, standing alone on a train platform, watching a man walk away laughing. He had no idea who he was laughing at. Elena Marsh was 44 years old, though grief and long nights had etched a few extra years into the corners of her eyes. She wore her hair pulled back simply, no jewelry beyond a thin wedding band she still hadn't found the strength to remove. To anyone passing her on the street, she looked like exactly what she appeared to be, a widow rebuilding her life one quiet day at a time, working long hours at a small bookkeeping office near the train station, balancing other people's ledgers while her own life felt permanently out of balance. What no one knew, not her neighbors, not her coworkers, not even most of her extended family, was that Elena had spent 18 years before her husband's death as the quiet architect behind one of the most respected private investment consultancies on the East Coast. She had built it from nothing alongside her husband, David, a man whose name still appeared on brass plaques and industry awards, though it had always been Elena's mind behind the numbers, her instinct behind the deals that mattered. When David passed away 2 years ago, sudden and cruel, Elena had done something almost no one in her position would do. She disappeared. Not literally. She still went to the market, still nodded to neighbors, still paid her taxes on time. But she stepped back entirely from the world of high finance, sold her stake in quiet, unannounced transactions, and let the world assume that with David gone, the company he'd founded had gone fully independent. She told no one that she still held the controlling interest in Colton Holdings' single largest silent investor fund, the fund that had quietly financed Richard Colton's meteoric rise over the last 3 years. Richard Colton, meanwhile, had built an entirely different kind of reputation. At 39, he was the golden name of Colton Holdings, a man who'd inherited a modest firm from his father and, through aggressive marketing, expensive suits, and an even more expensive personality, transformed it into a brand synonymous with luxury and ambition. He filled elite galas with his presence, name-dropped clients he barely remembered meeting, and treated every assistant, driver, and junior associate like furniture that occasionally needed reminding of its place. His downfall, though he did not know it yet, had already been quietly written, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity, the moment his decisions threatened everything Elena and David had built. It started 3 weeks earlier, in a modest office building far from Colton Holdings' Glass Tower headquarters. Elena had been asked, informally, almost apologetically, by an old colleague named Marcus Webb to review a set of quarterly disclosures for a fund he managed. Marcus didn't know the full truth of who Elena was to that fund. Few people did anymore. He simply knew she'd once had a sharp eye for numbers and needed a second opinion before a board meeting. What Elena found in those disclosures made her blood run cold. Richard Colton had been quietly over-leveraging client capital, funneling investor funds into a string of high-risk real estate ventures under his own name, and papering over the losses with borrowed money disguised as returns. It was the kind of scheme that worked beautifully until it didn't. And when it collapsed, as these things always eventually did, it wouldn't just be Richard's fortune that vanished. It would be the retirement funds of teachers, the college funds of families, the life savings of people who had trusted the Colton name because it had once meant something under David Marsh's steady hand. Elena requested a meeting. Not as herself, not yet. She used a shell entity name tied to her holding company, an old formality David had insisted on years ago for privacy reasons that Elena had never bothered to change. The meeting was granted, almost dismissively, squeezed into Richard's schedule between a lunch reservation and a photo shoot for a business magazine profile. She arrived at Colton Holdings headquarters in her usual gray coat, carrying a plain leather folder instead of the branded portfolio cases the other executives favored. The receptionist barely looked up. In the elevator, two junior associates discussing, the numbers guy from some no-name fund coming in today didn't realize the woman standing quietly beside them was the very person they meant. Richard kept her waiting for 22 minutes. When he finally arrived, he didn't apologize. He glanced at her coat, at her folder, at her lack of any visible designer label, and made his judgment in under 3 seconds, the same instinctive cruelty that had defined his rise. "You're here about the Whitmore Fund inquiry," he said, not quite hiding his boredom. "Look, whoever briefed you clearly doesn't understand how sophisticated modern portfolio structuring works. I don't have time to walk a small fund manager through basic real estate leverage strategy." "I understand leverage strategy quite well," Elena said calmly, opening her folder. "What I don't understand is why 3 of your reported returns for Q2 don't match the actual capital movements in these accounts." Richard's jaw tightened, but his smile didn't waver, the practiced smile of a man who had talked his way out of harder rooms than this. "These figures are audited," he said smoothly. "Perhaps your firm's analysts made an error reading them." "They're not audited," Elena replied. "They're self-reported. There's a difference, and I think you know that." The room went quiet enough to hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. Richard leaned back, studying her now with something between irritation and disbelief that this unremarkable woman in a department store coat was pushing back at all. "I don't know who sent you," he said, his voice dropping into something colder. "But I built this company from a struggling regional firm into one of the most respected names in the industry. I don't need a lecture from someone who looks like she just walked out of a discount tax office." He let the words land, watching for the flinch he expected. It didn't come. "You didn't build it," Elena said quietly. "You inherited it. And you've spent the last 3 years quietly spending down the trust it took someone else 20 years to earn." Richard stood, done pretending at civility. "This meeting is over. I don't answer to anonymous fund managers hiding behind shell company names, and frankly, I don't think you have the standing to be in this building." Elena closed her folder and rose without a hint of anger in her movements. "You're right," she said softly. "I don't need a meeting to make my point. I'll let the paperwork do that instead." She left calmly, without slamming a door, without raising her voice, without giving Richard the satisfaction of a visible reaction. It was David's old rule, one she still carried like scripture: let the work speak. Anger is a currency you spend once and never get back. Outside, in the rain, Richard caught up to her at the train station, not to apologize, but to finish humiliating her, certain the conversation was already over and the outcome already decided in his favor. "You're finished here, Elena. Nobody wants a woman who can't even keep her own family together running anything, let alone advising my company." He didn't know her late husband's name had been on the fund's original paperwork. He didn't know whose signature still controlled the largest single position inside Colton Holdings' capital structure. He simply turned and walked back toward his car, laughing quietly to himself, feeling like a man who had just swatted away an insect. Elena watched him go, and for the first time in 2 years, something other than grief settled into her chest. Clarity. 12 to 1800 hours, the climax and the twist. 3 days later, Richard Colton sat in his glass-walled office reviewing the final details for a magazine profile shoot when his assistant knocked, visibly pale. "Mr. Colton, there's a legal team downstairs. They say it's urgent. Something about an emergency capital call and a fund restructuring notice." Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Tell them to email it. I have a shoot in 20 minutes. "Sir," his assistant said, voice tightening. "They say it's from Marsh Whitmore Holdings. They're asking to speak with you immediately about your controlling investor's intent to exercise a liquidation clause." The color drained from Richard's face. Marsh Whitmore Holdings wasn't a name that appeared often. It rarely needed to. It was the silent, controlling fund behind nearly 60% of Colton Holdings' operating capital, a fund he had always assumed was managed by a faceless institutional board somewhere, never once bothering to ask who actually sat behind it. The legal team was shown in. At the head of the small group, dressed in the same simple gray coat, carrying the same plain leather folder, was Elena Marsh. Richard stared at her, his mind scrambling to reassemble the pieces. You're the fund manager who came in for the inquiry." "I am," Elena said, taking a seat without waiting to be offered one. I'm also the majority controlling partner of Marsh Whitmore Holdings. My late husband, David Marsh, founded this fund with the original capital that financed your father's company's expansion 22 years ago. When David passed, full controlling interest transferred to me. I've simply chosen, until now, not to exercise it. Richard's phone buzzed violently on the desk, a call from his own CFO, panic evident even through the muffled speaker. He didn't answer it. Richard's voice cracked slightly. This is a mistake. There must be some kind of paperwork error. There's no error, Elena said, sliding a single document across the desk. Section 14, subsection C of the original capital agreement your father signed. Any material misrepresentation of fund performance to investors, or any unauthorized high-risk reallocation of managed capital exceeding 12% of total assets, triggers an immediate right of review and, if warranted, liquidation of the controlling position. You can't do this, Richard said, his composure fully cracking now, sweat visible at his temples. This will collapse the entire firm. Hundreds of employees. I'm not liquidating the firm, Elena said calmly. I'm removing you from operational control, effective immediately, pending a full independent audit. The firm your father built, and my husband financed, will survive. Whether your name remains attached to it depends entirely on what that audit finds. Richard's assistant reappeared at the door, holding the phone with trembling hands. Sir, it's the SEC compliance liaison. They say they've received a formal referral regarding reporting irregularities at the firm. Richard sank into his chair, the golden confidence that had carried him through every room for years finally, completely gone. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, seeing for the first time not a woman in a discount coat, but the quiet architect who had been standing behind everything he'd ever built the entire time. 1,800 hours. End. The payoff and catharsis. 6 months later, Colton Holdings still existed, though it operated under new independent oversight, its riskiest positions unwound, its remaining clients' capital protected under the emergency restructuring Elena had authorized. Richard Colton was no longer on the letterhead. He'd been permitted to resign quietly rather than face a public regulatory battle. A mercy Elena had insisted on, not for his sake, but for the sake of the employees who still needed jobs and the clients who still needed their trust in the firm slowly rebuilt. Elena herself never took Richard's old office. She didn't want it. She stepped in only long enough to steady the ship, appoint a trustworthy interim leadership team, and quietly begin transferring real operational control to a young analyst named Priya Anand. Sharp, humble, and entirely unimpressed by status. Exactly the kind of person David would have trusted. On her way out of the building for what would be her final formal visit, Elena passed Richard in the lobby, there to collect the last of his belongings. He looked smaller now, stripped of the tailored bravado that had once filled every room he entered. I didn't know, he said quietly. About you. About any of it. I know, Elena said. That was rather the point. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply adjusted the collar of her plain gray coat and walked out into the afternoon light, back toward the same train station where he'd once told her she was finished. She wasn't finished. She had simply, for 2 long years, been quiet. And sometimes, the loudest thing a person can do is stay silent, right up until the moment the truth speaks for itself.